Okay, hi guys, I'm Dan Larsson and this is the first round of the Skrillex snare drum tutorial, and this is the snare drum what we are going to create. So as you can see, this is a very heavy and punchy snare drum, and as you may remember, this snare drum contains only synthesizers, no samples, no additional samples from any kind of other musics or other stuffs, only synthesizers and only fm8. You may see, yes, these samples here, but these are resampled versions of the fm8 synthesizer sounds, because especially in the transient layer I needed to re-effect them. So I will explain this why I made this. But first let's see the layers. This snare drum contains 5 layers. The first is the transient layer. This is the resampled version of the transient, which is basically a small and tiny percussion kind of sound. So this was the affected and resampled version of it. And this is the one which comes from fm8. So no big difference, but in the music, in the snare drum, this change will mean a lot. So this will be needed to make these changes and make these effects. And the other important and very important layer is the bottom layer, which sounds like this. Which basically is a simple sine wave with a very smooth pitch envelope on it. And yes, this comes from fm8 too, but this one, and which you can see here, is the same method, but only comes from Virus, which, you know, Virus is a different instrument with different sound, so I prefer this one. You can see the difference. So this is the Virus, and this is fm8. I tried to create with fm8 a similar kind of sound which comes from the Virus, but I found it was impossible, because, you know, Virus is very strong in the low end. So I will give this part of the snare drum to you, but you can do the same. Probably maybe I was only the weak one who couldn't do this with fm8, but you will get the sample from Virus. So this is a very important part of the snare drum, but only with the bottom and the transient it sounds a little silly. These two layers, the transient and the bottom, is a very important part of the snare drum, because this will give the main character of the snare. But of course we will need a top layer, which sounds this, which is basically a kind of hi-hat sound. And yes, it comes from fm8 too, with various effects after it. And all together they sound like this. It is a lot more snare drum sound, but this still is very short, very tiny. So it will need a snare tail, which you can hear here. This noise kind of sound comes from fm8 too, but with 2 layers. The first layer sounds like this, and the other like this. all together they sound like this. And this is almost a very important part of the snare drum. Well, this time all of the parts are important, but the tail is still very important, because without the tail it sounds, well, I don't know, but a little silly and a little, you know, it won't be handy without the tail. But with the tail, it sounds really cool. So this is the overview of the snare drum, but I forgot to tell you the most and very important part of the snare drum creating method, which is the distortion. You know, the snare drum is very, very heavily distorted. It clips like hell, but this clipping and this distortion, this overdrive, will give the taste of the snare drum. Without it, it will sound a little silly. So as you can see, it's very heavily clipping, but if I pull down, it just doesn't sound the same. Although we have a lot of distortion on the bottom layer and on the transient and other layers, but it still needs to be overdriven. So the snare drum sounds like this with heavy overdrive. But without the overdrive, the clipping, it just loses its taste. So we have to heavily overdrive it. This isn't a problem, because as you can see here in the music, in the snare drum, you can see it is still very overdriven and sounds very, very cool. And if you can see, and if you watch the original snare drum of Skrillex, you can see that it's still very heavily overdriven. So this will be the method. This overview is the first part of the tutorial, but in this first part we will create the bottom layer as well. So let's create a new MIDI channel and drop fm8 onto it. Hey, I said drop it. Drop the bass. Okay, so this is fm8. Click on expert, and with F oscillator, push up the ratio to 2 and select the smooth square wave oscillator type. The waveform should be the soft square. I adjust a little the release of the oscillator and click on the pitch envelope. Okay, so with the pitch envelope we push up the attack and pull down the sustain and make it a very short decay. Okay, this will be a smooth pitch envelope on the bottom layer. Oh, sorry, I forgot to add a note on the MIDI channel, and I will use G2. You may use any kind of note depending on your taste. So I'm soloing it, and let's see how it sounds. Well, it sounds nothing, because we need to push up the envelope, the amplitude envelope of the pitch envelope, sorry, yes, about 46. And shorten it. Okay, this is the first step. We need to add some effects to the sound, which is in the first circle, or the first round, sorry, yes, the first round is an overdrive. Okay, let's push it up. It still sounds very different from now. And tube amp. And the shelving EQ, this what I used. Okay, this was with fm8, but we need to add another chain of effects, and with the first I will use overdrive, widen it to affect the whole spectrum of the sound of the frequencies, and pull down the drive. So this will sound like this. It sounds a lot different now, and I used a saturator, and I only pushed that the drive to about, I don't know, 6. And yes, this sounds very cool, and we will need an effect to push up the frequencies at about 2 and 3, between 2 and 300 hertz. And I maybe subtract the middle frequencies. Okay, so this will be our bottom layer. But as I told you, we can do this with virus too. Yeah, because it sounds a lot different, and for my taste, from virus it sounds a lot better. So I'm going to show you the settings of the virus. I use Sound Diver. I use a simple sine wave, and I cut off the high frequencies and the middle frequencies and boost up the resonance to about 84. I use the split mode for the filters, and I used a very smooth amount of frequency. What is this? Frequency modulation, and a pitch envelope I used too. And of course I used another instance of the pitch envelope at LFO1 for oscillator 1 only. And I don't know what this does, but maybe it affects the filter too very, very smoothly. I don't know is it necessary, but okay, I use that. And the other important thing for if you have, for example, a virus, is to add a rate reducer and pull it up, and a light distortion, a patch distortion, and boost it up to 8.8. Okay, this was mainly the settings, and yes, please set the oscillator phase to 38, and I think there is nothing else besides the envelopes, because I use the same envelope settings in fm8 too. So okay, this was it. I think this will be very handy for you in the first round, and in the next part we will create the transient. So still then, please be excited, and so I was Dan Larson again. See you next time, guys.